Chapter 9. The passengers' tongues were wagging long after the coach arrived at its destination. News of how the one-eyed stage driver saved the lives of those people spread like warm honey. For years after that, Charlotte caused all sorts of commotion every time she drove into town. Folks started tossing $3 gold pieces in the road to see if she could hit them with the wheels of the stagecoach. Seems that if a one-eyed driver could run over your coin, you'd have good luck. Grown men would stand on the side of the road and wait for the stage to come through. Children running behind the stage collected the coins and delivered them like offerings to a hero. And folks just gathered around to hear what One-Eyed Charlie had to say, though, as usual, there wasn't much. "Here, Charlie, you hit this one little girl said, giggling. "My pockets are already jangling," Charlotte said. "Papa says you're not scared of nothin'," said another. "That's not true. I'm as scared as you are," said Charlotte. "I just do what I have to do." "What are you going to buy with all that money?" asked a small boy. Charlotte said, "I'm going to buy something I've wanted since I was knee-high." "A new horse?" said the boy. "Nope," said Charlotte. "A new gun?" "Nah, I already got one already, and don't use it except to scare off bandits," said Charlotte. "It's something much better than both of them things." Charlotte was driving a new route from San Juan Bautista to Santa Cruz. She had moved from Sacramento and was sleeping in a barn loft again, but this time at a way station, where the stage drivers changed horses. Frank and James had promised her that it was a beautiful run. They were right. It was the kind of country that Charlotte loved. Toward the east, mountains, and in the west, rolling hills that sometimes met the ocean. It was greener than Sacramento, and Charlotte even liked the fog that made the mornings last longer. But the way station was another story. Stage drivers changed horses every 12 miles, and most of the way stations were pitiful, including this one. It was a dirty, run-down station for 15 or so horses. If the passengers had to spend the night, they slept in a hut on a dirt floor. The food was mostly rancid bacon, mustard greens, corn doggers, and sandy coffee. Now that she had the money, Charlotte couldn't wait to move. Couldn't wait to buy her own place. One afternoon, while riding a horse toward Watsonville to mail a letter to Hayward, she saw a for sale sign in a pasture. She turned her horse down the road, and at the end, there was a cabin with a few corrals. A sturdy, gray-haired woman came out of the rustic chicken coop with a basket of eggs on her arm. As she walked, she held herself tall. "You hear about the property?" "Yes, ma'am," said Charlotte. "The owners don't live here anymore. I'm Margaret. I got the small house farther down the main road. I feed the chickens and collect the eggs." "You know anything about the land?" asked Charlotte. "Well, best I know, it's 25 acres. There's an apple orchard that needs tending real bad. 40 laying hens. Front pasture runs all the way to the main road in town." Charlotte looked toward the main road. That acreage would make a perfect way station. She knew that if she could get Ebenezer out here, he'd do a finer job than anyone managing it. Charlotte turned her attention back to the woman. "Any other neighbors?" "I'm the closest," said Margaret, "but it don't look like for long. I was widowed last year, and my husband still owed money on the mortgage. I've been trying to keep up the payments. I sell the eggs in town to get by, but the bank's threatening to foreclosure." "Where are you moving?" asked Charlotte. "Well, now that's a quandary," she said, looking out over the land. "Lived here most of my days, but don't have family. Don't want to leave, but I can't pay, and the bank, well, they need their money." For an instant, her face clouded over and her warm brown eyes reflected sadness. "If you're looking for another bit of land, I guess the bank would sell you mine in a hurry," said Margaret. "Well, I'll be on my way. Good luck, young man." And she turned and walked down the road. Charlotte surveyed the property. She had known the moment she came down the lane that it was the land she'd been looking for. She'd saved a substantial amount of money. She could afford it. As she rode to the bank to inquire, though, instead of thinking about the 25 acres and the home she could finally own, she couldn't get her mind off Margaret and the home she stood to lose. A few days later, Charlotte offered $600 in gold coin for the property. The bank president handed Charlotte a pen. She signed the papers. You just bought a fair portion of what is called Rancho Corlitos, said the president. Thank you, said Charlotte. Tell me about the land to the west, the small parcel where the widow lives. The wife can't pay, so we're foreclosing. She hasn't got a cent. Hate to do it, but women usually can't pay, and after all, business is business. Charlotte nodded. The bank president grabbed Charlotte's hand and pumped it up and down. Congratulations, it's been a pleasure, Mr. Parkhurst. It all happened so fast that afterward, as Charlotte stood on the bank steps, smiling, she wondered if it had been a dream. She couldn't resist riding back out to see the place again. It was late afternoon as she turned down the road. Her road. The sky clouded and the early evening mist settled in the air. When she reached the hillock, she stopped and looked out over her land. The west wind blew in a breeze off the Pacific Ocean. The pasture swayed in one continuous rolling wave. Pinkish dots showed on the orchard trees as the apples ripened. Charlotte's heart filled at the sight of it. I did it, she thought. I did it. She saw herself picking the apples and raising horses, and she pictured Hayward right alongside her, training the horses to be ridden, just like they had imagined all those years ago at the orphanage. But as proud as she was that she had done what she set out to do, there was a part of her that felt like something was missing. After all, this had been Hay's dream, too. That night, she would write to Ebenezer and tell him if he had any sense he should come. She needed him to start the way station. Besides, she missed him. Then she would write to Hayward and tell him the news. But it had been so many months since she'd heard from him. Had something happened to him? Was his heart settled in a new place and he didn't want to tell her? Mail being what it is, it could take a month for a letter to travel east and a month to get an answer. But Charlotte went to the post office every few days anyway. When she heard from Ebenezer, Charlotte grinned ear to ear and let out a loud whoop. He was coming for a visit in the spring, and if he liked it, he'd stay. She couldn't wait to see him again. Maybe by then she'd have some horses. Charlotte moved into her house, and since business was business, she had gone back to that bank president and purchased Margaret's small parcel of land to the west. Then she and Margaret had struck an agreement. Margaret tended the chickens and eggs and did some cooking, and that was enough rent for Charlotte. After 4 months passed, the chickens were well cared for, and there were plenty of fresh eggs to sell. Margaret made applesauce, apple butter, and preserves. Charlotte hoped Ebenezer liked apples because he'd be eating them every which way. Charlotte rode home one evening, tired and dusty. She was familiar with every shadow of her property, but in the waning light, she could tell that something was wrong. She stared hard in the dim light with her good eye to figure out what it was. In the front pasture, there was something different, something wooden. A box? Who would have left a wood box in her front pasture? After she moved in, she had found a burlap sack tossed down her road. It was a litter of kittens that someone had abandoned. She took them in and nursed them all, and now they ran all over her orchard. Had someone tried to leave another poor animal on her property, this time in a wooden box? As she rode closer, she realized that it wasn't a wooden box at all, but a sign. Someone had pounded a wooden sign in her front pasture and painted some words on the front. Puzzled, she walked her horse through the tall pasture grass so she could get a good look. Her heart leaped at the sight. She turned the horse and galloped toward the cabin. Painted on the signs were the words, "Private Property." Sitting on her front porch, playing with an arm full of kittens, was a lanky, broad-shouldered, red-haired man with the biggest ears Charlotte had ever seen. Hayward! Ugh, I'm going to cry. She tied her horse and bounded up the porch. She hugged him long and hard. Hey, you're taller than me and twice as strong. I don't think I can stand it, said Charlotte. It's about time I could be better than you at something, he said, laughing. They studied each other. Hay had never seen Charlotte's eye patch before, and she was suddenly embarrassed. I'm plumb blind in that eye, she said. You don't look much different, said Hay, but you would scare William to death. They both laughed. Memories of the orphanage flooded over Charlotte. When Hay reached for a runaway kitten, Charlotte noticed the thin leather tied around his wrist. You still got the leather bracelet, she said, and held out her arm next to his to compare. Both leather bands were soft and rolled from years of wear. Remember that day, Charlotte? As well as you, she said. They hugged again. So many years had passed between them. They were older, but everything about him seemed familiar. I missed you, Charlotte. Me too, hey. Charlotte had been so hungry to see him that all she could do was stare. She started to reach up and ruffle his hair, but when she hesitated, an awkward silence came over them. He finally said, "Well, I made it to California." And when she remembered her manners, she said, "Sit down and tell me what you've been doing." "Well, after my folks moved to Missouri, I rode for Pony Express, but that didn't last long. About a year and a half. The transcontinental telegraph and the railroad took its place right quick. After that, I needed work, so I moved cattle for a while, and I've been stock tendering some." He grinned. "Been saving my money for California." Charlotte smiled. It was the same old Hay chattering away, as eager as ever to tell her everything. She relaxed. Nothing had changed. "Now my folks want to move west, so when I got the chance to ride out with a wagon train, I knew I had to come to learn the roads. And to see you. That's where I've been all these months, on a wagon train. I saved every one of your letters. I can't believe it's you, Charlotte." "I know it's hard to believe, but I'm the same old Charlotte, fighting and scrapping my way." "You still driving?" he asked. "Some. I aim to make my property the way station. Change the teams when they come through. I'll take care of the horses and buy a few of my own with the money I bring in. Ebenezer's coming for a visit, and I'm going to do my best to get him to stay. For all my traveling around, I didn't ever think I'd want to stay put, but for some reason, I'm contented as a new mare." "You got a new mare?" "Oh, I'm contented as my new mare." "You got a new mare? Will she foal in the spring?" he asked. "Yep," she said. He nodded his head and grinned. "I guess we're as far away from the orphanage as we'll ever get." "What do you hear about the orphanage?" "Well, I saw some of the boys now and then. Last I heard, Millshark's still there, but Mrs. Boyle's gone. I heard William got adopted the year after me by an elderly couple who needed someone to work their farm. I guess the man loved his animals, and William beat his prize mare, so they sent him back. First boy in years that got unadopted. Don't that figure? You heard about Vern, that he passed on." "No," said Charlotte quietly. "I didn't know. But for some reason I suspected. He was getting on in years when we were there. I won't ever be forgetting him for what all he'd done for me." Charlotte got teary-eyed and didn't even try to hide it. She pulled out her handkerchief and wiped her eyes. Hayward looked around the cabin. "You done good, Charlotte. You done real good." Chapter 10. Hayward stayed for a month of Sundays, and Charlotte couldn't bear thinking about him leaving again. The morning he left, she said, "Hey, you can stock tender for me as long as you like." "Charlotte, I'm beginning to think you like having me around," he teased. "I never thought I'd see the day. But first, I've got work to finish in Missouri. Then I got to help my folks move out here." He hesitated, then said, "Charlotte, come with me." Charlotte looked out the window as if she hadn't heard him. "It'll take me over a year, Charlotte. You could get someone to watch the place, and then Ebenezer could take over till we got back. Won't you come?" She turned and looked at him. "I can't, Hay. I don't want to leave. I've worked my whole life for this. I belong here. I want to build up my horse stock, and I've got apples to pick and things I've got to do. Besides, there's something I've been thinking on for some time that I feel real strongly about." She knew she could tell Hay anything, but she wasn't sure how he'd react to this. "I registered to vote in Santa Cruz County. The election's in a few weeks, and I don't want to miss it." Hayward stared at her and shook his head. "Charlotte, you'll be going against the law." "Hey, I know more about who to vote for than most. Women are citizens of this country just like you. They work hard and make decisions sound as a man." "There's a lot of folks who don't agree." "There's a lot of men who don't agree," said Charlotte. Hayward grinned at her. "I ain't one of them," he said. "I just don't understand what you'll be proving if no one knows you're a woman." "I guess I'm proving that here I am, a member of this county that most folks respect. Most of them ask me who I'm voting for, and the only reason I can walk in and vote is because they think I'm a man. Sooner or later, they'll all know I was a woman and my point will be made. So someday you're going to let people know you're a lady, he asked. Maybe, but whether I let them know or not, I'll be wearing these same clothes and tending my horses and running this ranch, same as always. He considered what she said and shook his head. You know you're mine, Charlotte, and that's fine by me. You know how I feel about you. I know. He gave her a big hug and acted like he was never going to let go. Then he got on his horse and rode down the lane past the corral. Charlotte stood on the porch and watched him ride away. He stopped halfway down the road and waved his hat. Charlotte waved back. He put his hat back on and cupped his hands around his mouth. I'll be back, he hollered. I know, Charlotte whispered to herself. It was sprinkling when Charlotte rode into town that November afternoon, but a little rain couldn't stop her. She hoped it wouldn't stop other folks from getting out and doing what they had to do either. Luckily, by the time she got to town, the sun had come out. She hitched the Mustang and walked down the street and nodded to the people walking by. A big sign in the window of the hotel said polls. Some of the ladies in town went about their errands and didn't seem to give a second thought to the long line of men in front of the hotel. Others gathered out front in twos and threes, waiting for their menfolk, and acted like there was nothing special going on inside. Charlotte wondered if they really didn't care, or if they were going about playing their roles like she was playing hers. One man came up and clapped her on the back. Glad to see you, Charlie, he said. Another man said, Pretty exciting day, ain't it, Charlie? Charlie didn't say much. She shook hands all around and got in line with the men. She listened to them banter and joke about her. Heard Wyoming's going to give women the right to vote. I thought I'd heard everything. What's this country coming to? What do you think, Charlie? Charlotte said, I don't think it hurts nothing. Guess they know their minds as well as us. Don't hurt nothing. Them women fighting for this is just plain crazy, stirring up trouble all over. They'll be the ruination of this country. I told my wife that she wouldn't ever be voting as long as she's married to me, no matter what the law says. What does she know about politics? Several other men added their opinions. The line inched up the hotel steps. A little boy ran up, found his father in line, and tugged on his hand. Papa, Papa, the Taylor boy and Sarah and I can't play ball 'cause I'm little and she's a girl. And she's fighting him in the street, and he's twice as big as her. Hurry, Papa. The father shook his head. We told her about fighting. When's that girl gonna learn? The men chuckled, and the father and the little boy left. The line moved closer to the desk. Charlotte got to the front and signed the book. The registrar handed her the ballot. She studied the names. Horatio Seymour or Ulysses S. Grant. The conservative Democrat or the much-talked-about Republican. She had listened to the talk and heard people's debates. She had heard good things and bad things about both men, but she knew her own mind and what she thought was right. You know who you're voting for, Charlie? Asked the man next to her. Yes, I do, said Charlotte. Old Jake couldn't make it today because he's ailing. Felt real bad about not coming, but I told him one vote won't make no difference. Charlotte nodded to the man. Would her one vote make a difference? Why would she be doing this? Someday when people found out, would they just think she had been crazy too, or would they wonder that she had a good reason? Yes, she told herself, she had a good reason. There was something she could do for that woman who stood up in front of all those laughing men and passed out handbills on the saloon steps. Something for those women out front who were pretending they didn't mind that they couldn't vote. For Vern, who hadn't been allowed to speak up and should have been able to. And for that little girl outside who was already standing up for herself. She smiled. And for me, she thought, because I'm as qualified as the next man. She marked her choice for President of the United States. She turned in her ballot, then faced the crowd of men still waiting in line. She tipped her hat. Gentlemen, she said, may the best man win. Then she walked out of the hotel, got on her horse, and rode home. Now this section is called In the End. Ebenezer arrived in the spring just before the fowl. He surveyed the property and grumbled about all the things that should be done. The pasture fence needed mending, and the chickens needed a new coop. Margaret needed help selling the eggs in town. Charlotte was tickled because she figured all his belly aching meant he'd come to stay. And the fowl, it came in the middle of the night, in the middle of a thunderstorm. It gave Charlotte fits and worries because it was Breech, trying to come out the wrong way. She coaxed it as best as she knew, but when she was afraid they'd both be lost, she woke up Ebenezer. The two sat up all night soothing the mother horse, who was as frightened by the thunder as she was by the birthing. While Ebenezer tried to deliver the fowl, Charlotte paced like an expectant father. Her mind was on the night she set up with Freedom, and she was remembering Vern. If he were here, he'd be telling her to settle down, that Ebenezer knew what he was doing. Vern had been right about so many things. But Charlotte needn't have worried. By the time the rooster crowed, a wet, folded-up bundle of legs was delivered, a filly. The baby horse barely stood on her wobbly legs when Ebenezer said, "There's another one coming, twins!" In a few frantic minutes, a colt stood next to his sister. "What are you going to name them?" asked Ebenezer. "You should call them Worry and Trouble for the night they gave us." And then he laughed. But Charlotte got quiet and serious-like. "Naming's something important," she said, "and a name should stand for something. A horse's name should be fitting for the fine animal." She watched the fowls and didn't say anything. The mare licked the colts, and the filly started nursing. And after she considered them for some time, Charlotte crossed her arms and nodded her head with a knowing smile. It had come to her. "Well, you going to keep it to yourself?" said Ebenezer. Charlotte was right proud to explain her reasoning behind it all. And when she finally finished, Ebenezer had to agree. There were fine names, important names that stood for something and that were fitting for fine animals. She named the colt Vern's Thunder, and she named the filly Freedom. The end. Now, this is a note from the author. This fictional novel is based on the true story of Charlotte Darky Parkhurst, also known as One-Eyed Charlie, Cock-Eyed Charlie, and Six-Horse Charlie. The following is a synopsis of her life, derived from research. She was born in some part of New Hampshire in 1812 and lived in an orphanage or poorhouse. She went to Worcester, Massachusetts, where she worked as a stable boy in Ebenezer Balch's stables and remained there until Mr. Balch moved his business to Providence, Rhode Island. There she continued to work for him at What Cheer Stables, at that time located in the rear of the Franklin House Inn. Considered an expert stage driver, she worked for Mr. Balch for a number of years. For a brief period, she left for Atlanta and then returned to Providence and worked in several other stables. About 1849, James E. Birch and Frank Stevens went to California, and a few years later consolidated several small stage lines into the California Stage Company. They recruited Charlie to work for them. Shortly after arriving in California, Charlotte lost the use of one eye from a horse kick to the face. Still posing as a male or boy, by the 1860s, she was a noted whip or juha, a biblical term referring to a charioteer of the time. Charlotte retired from driving at a ranch near Watsonville, California. Her name, Charles Darky Parkhurst, is listed in the Santa Cruz Centennial on August 17, 1868, under the official poll list, containing the names and enrollment for all persons resident in the various precincts in the county of Santa Cruz, state of California, registered up to October 4th, 1868, and entitled to vote at the presidential election. Some historians think that Charlotte first voted on November 3rd, 1868, at Tom Mann's Hotel in downtown Soquel, California, where the Soquel fire station now stands. After Charlie's death, it was discovered that she was a woman. Deeds and records confirm that Charlotte, disguised as Charles Parkhurst, owned property in Watsonville. Charlotte's cabin was near the 7 Mile House, a former stagecoach stop and hotel. This way station for travelers on the Santa Cruz to Watsonville stage line was located on a road that was later named Freedom Boulevard. Charlotte also registered to vote in Santa Cruz County, 52 years before any woman would be allowed to vote in federal elections in the United States. In 1955, the Pajora Valley Historical Association marked her grave with a monument that reads, Charlie Darky Parkhurst, 1812 to 1879. Noted whip of the Gold Rush days, drove stage over Mount Madonna in early days of Valley. Last run San Juan to Santa Cruz. Death in cabin near the 7 Mile house. Revealed one-eyed Charlie, a woman. The first to vote in the U.S., November 3rd, 1868. I have tried to keep the storyline close to her real life, but for purposes of the novel, I sometimes had to take creative license. For instance, in actuality, Charlotte Parkhurst was born in 1812 and would have been 55 years old when she voted. I moved the time frame of the story to the mid-1800s and spanned fewer years of her life in consideration for young readers. We will never really know Charlotte's motives for choosing to live her life the way she did. Possibly she did what she had to do to survive during a time when there were very few opportunities for young women. I suspect that she stumbled upon the chance to become a stage driver and that she was good at it and that it gave her personal freedoms that she would never have experienced as a girl. That freedom would have been very hard for anyone to give up once they had experienced it. In the words of her obituary, who shall longer say that a woman cannot labor and vote like a man? The end.